Day 57. If their logbook, kept by First Watch Officer Klaus Richter, hadn't finally lied. If consciousness hadn't yet turned into a viscous sludge of hallucinations and memories. The 57th day in the Atlantic, which had ceased to be a battlefield and had become a faceless, indifferent desert. U-515, once a fearsome predator, a steel wolf of Admiral Dönitz, was now just rusty junk, a helpless buoy that the Gulf Stream, that great underwater river, was dragging into the unknown. On the bridge stood 3 men. They no longer looked like sailors of the Kriegsmarine. They looked like scarecrows, like sun-dried mummies wrapped in parchment skin. Captain Lieutenant Werner Henke, their commander, the rock upon which the sanity of his crew rested, stared west. His eyes, bleached by the sun and the bottomless blue, were like 2 shards of ice. He had long since stopped looking for salvation there. He was looking for an end. Any end. Next to him, leaning against the periscope housing, stood Chief Engineer Erich Funke. His hands, which could once strip down any diesel engine by touch alone, now hung uselessly at the sides of his emaciated body. He wasn't looking at the horizon, but down at the deck where their makeshift rainwater collection system, a stretched tarpaulin and a copper pipe ripped from the galley, seemed a monument to both their genius and their despair. The third was the young seaman, Franz Bauer, a 19-year-old boy who had dreamed of the Iron Cross and telling stories to his friends in his home village. Now he dreamed of only one thing, a glass of cold water. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and he licked them with his salty tongue, inflicting fresh torment upon himself just to feel some moisture. Inside the steel hull, in the searing guts of the submarine, where the air was as thick and foul as the breath of a dying beast, the rest were hiding. 41 men, or what was left of them. They had stopped talking long ago. They made sounds. Moans in their sleep, the grinding of teeth, the shuffling of feet on the iron floor. They had become a single organism, united by only 3 sensations: thirst, hunger, and a dull, endless waiting. Their empire, built of discipline and despair, was held together by the iron will of Captain Henke and the fragile hope that their drift would one day end. How had they come to this? How had the elite of the Third Reich submarine fleet, the proud hunters applauded by crowds, turned into these ragged wretches praying for rain and a stray fish to snag on a wire hook? To understand how the steel wolf became a rusty coffin, we must go back 57 days. To the last day they were still men, and not ghosts. To the day the ocean decided to play its cruel game with them. To the day they heard the first ping of an enemy sonar. To understand the depth of their fall, you must see the height from which they plunged. June 1943. The naval base in Lorient, France. U-515 sat at the pier, gleaming with fresh paint, predatory and perfect in its deadly geometry. She was not just a machine. She was a symbol. A symbol of dominance in the Atlantic. A symbol of unbending will and technical genius. Her crew of 44 men were a match for their boat. These were not green recruits, but hardened veterans, the gray wolves of propaganda. Each had been through the hell of underwater attacks. Each knew the taste of salty fear and the intoxicating joy of victory. They were a family, a brotherhood, forged by shared dangers and shared secrets. Their commander, Captain Lieutenant Werner Henke, was the epitome of the ideal submariner. 30 years old, reserved, with a piercing gaze of steel-gray eyes, he did not command. He led. His men believed in him more than they believed in God. He was their guarantee of survival, their talisman. It was said that Henke could sense enemy convoys from hundreds of miles away, that he could speak the ocean's language. That evening, before setting out on another patrol, the wardroom was buzzing with life. A gramophone played, and cheap French wine was poured. The first watch officer, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a cynical and witty intellectual from Hamburg, was spinning yarns about his exploits ashore. He was Henke's complete opposite. If the captain was a rock, Richter was a raging torrent. He was a brilliant tactician, but a devilish glint of ambition always danced in his eyes. He respected Henke, but secretly dreamed of taking his place. In a corner, away from the general noise, sat Chief Engineer Erich Funke. He was a silent genius, a wizard who could make any mechanism work. To him, the diesels were living creatures with their own personalities and whims. He didn't drink wine, he drank tea, and read a worn volume on thermodynamics. His world consisted of pressure gauges, valves, and the smell of diesel. He was the heart of the boat, its invisible engine. And beside him, listening to his rare comments, sat the old boatswain, Gunther Weber, a man who seemed to have been born at sea. His face was a map of sea winds and storms, and his faded eyes held the wisdom of generations of sailors. He didn't believe in blueprints and calculations. He believed in omens, in the color of the sunset, in the behavior of seagulls. He was the soul of the boat, the keeper of its ancient knowledge. The youngest crew member, Seaman Franz Bauer, was writing a letter to his fiancée, Anna. He described the Paris he had seen for only a day, promised to bring her silk stockings, and swore his eternal love. He did not yet know that this letter would never be sent. That evening they were full of hope. Their mission was to patrol near the Azores, the so-called Milch Cow area, where American convoys were particularly vulnerable. It promised easy prey and new metals. They laughed, sang songs, and made plans for the future. They were hunters, heading out on their hunt. None of them could imagine that this patrol would be their last, that their perfect, invincible U-515 would soon become their common grave. That night, as the boat silently slipped away from the pier, Captain Henke stood on the bridge for a long time, gazing into the dark water. The old boatswain Weber approached him and said quietly, "The moon is in a fog, Captain. The sea is in a foul mood tonight, as if it's hiding something." Henke merely nodded in silence. He was a pragmatist and didn't believe in omens, but at that moment even he felt a faint, inexplicable chill run down his spine. Catastrophe never arrives with a warning. It does not knock. It kicks the door off its hinges, bursting in with a roar and chaos. The 10th day of the patrol. U-515 was at periscope depth, stalking a fat target, a large transport ship that had strayed from its convoy. The atmosphere in the central control room was electric. Silence, broken only by the hum of the electric motors and Captain Henke's crisp, clipped commands. "Torpedo tube number 1 ready. Tube number 2 ready." He stared into the periscope eyepiece, his face an impenetrable mask of concentration. The transport grew in the crosshairs, defenseless, enormous. It was a perfect attack. "Tube 1, fire!" The boat shuddered slightly. A few dozen seconds later, a dull, distant explosion confirmed the hit. "Tube 2, fire!" A second explosion, more powerful than the first, shattered the silence. Not a single muscle twitched on Henke's face. "Dive to 90 meters. We're leaving." They began their slow descent into the safety of the depths, leaving a sinking ship and panicking men on the surface. It was their job. A brutal job, but a job nonetheless. But this time, something went wrong. The escorting destroyer, which they hadn't noticed, proved faster and more experienced than they'd anticipated. The first ping of the sonar struck their ears like a hammer on an anvil, a sharp, piercing sound that made the blood run cold. "Sonar contact, destroyer, bearing down on us." Henke gave the order. "Hard to starboard, full ahead, depth 150. The boat trembled, plunging into the dark abyss. But it was too late. The first pattern of depth charges exploded somewhere nearby. The hull groaned like a wounded beast. The lights flickered and died, plunging the compartments into pitch-black darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in, snatching terrified faces from the gloom. "No damage," came the reports from the compartments. They had held. But the destroyer was relentless. It circled above them like a hawk, methodically dropping its deadly payload. The explosions grew closer, more deafening. The hull metal vibrated so intensely it felt like it would shatter into atoms. Books and dishes flew from the shelves. Men pressed themselves against the bulkheads, praying to their gods. And then came the one explosion. It was different from the others. It wasn't nearby. It was inside. A deafening crack, as if a giant had snapped a steel beam in two. The boat was thrown upward and then violently slammed down. A scream of horror and pain came from the aft compartment. "Aft torpedo room is flooding! Breach in the pressure hull! Diesels are shattered!" It was a death sentence. Water, under immense pressure, gushed inside, crushing men and metal. Without losing a second, Henke gave the most terrible order in any submariner's life. "Seal the aft compartment." "Now!" The sailors, pale as death, threw their weight against the massive bulkhead door, sealing their comrades behind it, condemning them to a quick and horrific death. Their screams could be heard for a few moments through the thick steel. And then there was silence. The boat, taking on water, sank like a stone. "Blow all ballast tanks, all compartments! Blow!" Compressed air roared into the tanks, forcing the water out. The descent slowed, then stopped. And then, slowly, reluctantly, like a tired whale, U-515 began to rise. They had escaped the abyss. When they opened the upper hatch, a fresh, salty wind and blinding sunlight hit them in the face. The destroyer was gone. It had left, assuming them destroyed. They were alive, but their boat was dead. The engines were wrecked. The radio was smashed to pieces. The aft rudders were jammed. They had surfaced in the middle of the boundless ocean in a steel box that could never dive again and could never move under its own power. Henke surveyed his men. Their faces showed shock, fear, but also relief. They had survived. But the captain was already looking ahead. He saw not salvation, but the beginning of a new nightmare. He looked at Richter, then at Funke, at Weber, and in that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he had to become more than their commander. He had to become their jailer, their dictator, their only hope. The first days after the catastrophe were soaked in a mixture of euphoria from survival and a sticky, creeping dread. The ocean, which had once been their battlefield, a tactical space, had now become an endless blue prison. The horizon was a wall from which there was no escape. The first thing Henke did was take inventory. The results were grim. 3 men dead in the aft compartment. Fresh water supplies for about 10 days under the strictest rationing. Provisions for 2 weeks. The batteries were almost dead, which meant no proper lighting or ventilation. The boat was turning into an iron coffin, scorching hot under the sun by day and an icy crypt by night. The first signs of anarchy appeared quickly. On the second day, a sailor driven to despair by thirst tried to drink seawater. He was stopped at the last second. He screamed that a quick death was better than a slow fading away. It was the first crack in the armor of their discipline. Klaus Richter, the first officer, proposed a bold, but in his opinion, the only viable plan. He believed they should cannibalize everything possible to repair the radio, even if it meant using up all the distilled water from the batteries and the men's last ounce of strength. "We need a signal, Werner," he urged Henke. "One short signal, and they'll start looking for us. Sitting and waiting is suicide." But Henke, with the cold mind of an engineer, understood the futility of this idea. The radio wasn't just damaged, it was obliterated. Trying to fix it would be a senseless waste of precious resources and time. He refused. It was their first open conflict. In Richter's eyes, Henke saw not just disagreement, but contempt. He thought the captain was broken, that he had lost the will to fight. On the third day, Henke gathered the entire remaining crew in the central control room. In the dim light of an emergency lamp, his face looked as if it were carved from stone. His voice was steady and emotionless, but this only gave his words more weight. "From this moment on," he said, "we are no longer the crew of the submarine U-515. We are 41 men on a desert island made of steel. All military regulations are cancelled. My laws are now in effect. Law 1. All water and all food are communal. I will handle distribution personally. Any attempt to take more than your share will be considered sabotage and punished by death. Law 2. Any panic, any defeatist talk is forbidden. We will survive. But we will only survive together, by obeying a single will. My will. Anyone who disagrees can leave through the torpedo tube. A dead silence fell. The men looked at him with a mixture of fear and respect. They saw before them not their usual commander, but someone else. A cruel, unyielding dictator. But deep down, each of them understood that only this cruelty could save them. Thus began their new life. Henke imposed the harshest of rations, 150 grams of water per man per day, and a single hardtack biscuit. The men moved through the boat like shadows, conserving every movement, every word. By day, they hid from the merciless sun in the stuffy compartments. By night, they crawled out onto the deck to breathe the relatively fresh air. They looked at the stars, as distant and indifferent as the ocean beneath them. Hope faded with each passing day. They were far from the main shipping lanes. The chance of being spotted by accident was almost zero. On the 7th day, Boatswain Weber approached the captain. "The Gulf Stream," he said quietly, pointing to the barely perceptible movement of the water. "It's carrying us west, toward the American coast." There was no hope in his words. It was a simple statement of fact. They were being carried straight into the jaws of the enemy. On the 10th day, their water ran out. Completely. Only a rusty sludge remained in the tanks. That evening, as Henke distributed the last drops, he saw despair in his men's eyes. It seemed all was lost. But just then, the quiet chief engineer, Erich Funke, who had been sketching something on a piece of cardboard all these days, approached the captain and uttered words that were both salvation and madness. "Captain, we have torpedoes, and in the torpedoes, there is compressed air. And we also have electric motors. I think I can build a desalinator." Erich Funke's idea was brilliant in its madness. To use their warheads not as weapons, but as a source of life. Inside each torpedo were flasks of air compressed to 200 atmospheres. This air was used to power the torpedo's engine. Furthermore, the torpedoes contained small steam gas generators. Funk proposed using the energy from the last remaining batteries to heat seawater and then condense the steam through a complex system of tubes, cooled by the compressed air from the torpedo flasks. It was the principle of a simple moonshine still, but on the scale of a submarine and using deadly technology. The plan was incredibly risky. Any mistake could lead to an explosion that would blow their rusty coffin to pieces. Klaus Richter was the first to object. "This is pure suicide," he yelled at Henke. "You'll let this mad mechanic blow us all up for the ghost of a chance at a few drops of water?" "We must conserve the batteries for an emergency signal." But Henke had already made his decision. He looked at the thirst-ravaged faces of his men and realized that a slow death from dehydration was no better than a quick one from an explosion. "Proceed, Funke," he ordered curtly. The work began, resembling a sacred ritual. Funk seemed transformed. His usual silence was replaced by an obsessive focus. He became a high priest performing a rite of salvation. Under his direction, the sailors began to dismantle the torpedoes cautiously like sappers, extracting the compressed air flasks. They cut tubes from non-essential systems, creating a condenser coil. Old Boatswain Weber, whose experience had nothing to do with thermodynamics, unexpectedly became his chief assistant. He remembered how his fisherman grandfather had desalinated water in his childhood, using an old kettle and wet rags. On his advice, they wrapped the coil in oil-soaked cloths, which he claimed would improve heat exchange. Funk initially dismissed this shamanism, but then with a shrug, he agreed. In this situation, any help was worth its weight in gold. For 3 days, they worked almost without sleep or rest. The torpedo room became an alchemist's laboratory. The smell of hot metal, the hissing of steam, and the quiet mumbling of Funk, who spoke to the parts as if they were living things. Finally, the system was assembled. Everyone froze in tense anticipation. Funke, his face wet with sweat, slowly turned the main valve. A hiss was heard. The system came to life. They waited. A minute. 10. An hour. And then, from the end of the copper tube, slowly, reluctantly, fell the first drop. Then a second. A third. Clean, fresh water. A faint, hoarse but joyful cheer echoed through the compartment. Men hugged, cried, laughed. It was not just water, it was hope. It was their first victory over the ocean. They had conquered thirst. The output of their hellish machine was minuscule, only a few liters a day, barely enough to sustain life. But it was life. They had been granted a reprieve. Henke personally distributed the precious liquid, measuring out 100 grams for each man. The taste of this water, warm and tinged with metal and machine oil, was divine. They drank it in small sips, savoring every drop. This first victory changed everything. It restored their will to fight. They realized their main enemy was not the ocean, not hunger, not thirst. Their main enemy was despair. And they had just dealt it a crushing blow. But they didn't know that their small vessel, smoking with warmth and life in the middle of the cold ocean, had attracted the attention of its other inhabitants, those who were also hungry. The first victory breathed new life into the crew. They were no longer passive victims awaiting their end. They became fighters. Captain Henke, seeing this glimmer of hope in his men's eyes, knew that this momentum had to be sustained. They needed a system, a purpose, a routine that would leave no time to dwell on the horror of their situation. He turned U-515 into a tiny, autonomous state with its own laws, economy, and production. The Empire of Nothing, as Klaus Richter later dubbed it in his diary. The day was now scheduled down to the minute. At sunrise, the desalinator began its work under the watchful eye of Erich Funke, who had become the most important man on board after the captain. His word in the torpedo room was law. The rest were divided into groups. One group, led by Boatswain Weber, was in charge of fishing. They unraveled steel cables to make fishing lines. Hooks were bent from nails. Bait consisted of pieces of oily rags and even buttons from their clothes. The catch was meager. Occasionally they managed to land a small sargassum fish, but every fish caught was a celebration. It was divided into 41 tiny pieces, and this morsel of raw, salty flesh seemed to them the most exquisite delicacy. Another group was responsible for scavenging anything useful. They stripped the wooden paneling from the cabins to use as fuel for warmth on cold nights. Copper wire from non-essential electrical circuits was used for more fishing lines. The tarpaulin from the bridge was turned into a rainwater collection system, which was now more valuable to them than gold. A third group stood watch. They scanned the horizon around the clock for any sign of smoke or a sail. This was the most grueling job, as it was a constant reminder of their solitude. The endless, empty blue was maddening. Henke imposed the strictest discipline. Reveille and lights out were signaled. Daily musters on the upper deck, where he inspected the men, checking their physical and moral condition. Any sign of weakness or insubordination was punished immediately and brutally by withholding the precious water ration. He became their father, tyrant, and God all at once. They feared him, but they also trusted him implicitly. His unbending will was the spine that held their fragile world together. They even created their own calendar. Every evening, First Officer Richter, who now served as the chronicler, would scratch another telemark on the bulkhead of the central control room. These marks were their only connection to time. Their life settled into a harsh but predictable rhythm. They were no longer sailors. They were a primitive tribe living on a steel island. They had adapted. They had learned to survive in hell. They had created their own civilization in the midst of chaos. But it was this very stability, this semblance of order, that gave rise to a new, even more terrible threat. Not from without, but from within. In the souls of men, worn down by monotony and the absence of a future, a mutiny began to brew. The human psyche is a fragile instrument. It can withstand a single powerful blow, but it shatters under monotonous, daily pressure. The rhythm established by Henke saved them from a quick death, but condemned their souls to a slow decay. The days bled into one endless, viscous nightmare of thirst, hunger, and waiting. And in this oppressive atmosphere, the seeds of doubt sown by Klaus Richter began to bear poisonous fruit. Richter was not a villain. He was a pragmatist to the bone. He saw the men weakening, saw the last spark of reason die in their eyes. He saw their empire turning into a floating madhouse, and he believed Henke's policy was a slow, humiliating suicide. He began to work in secret, speaking to the sailors one by one in the dark corners of the compartments. His words were logical and convincing. "Look at yourselves," he would whisper. "We're turning into animals. Henke wants us to drift until we die of scurvy or madness. He's broken. He's afraid to act. I'm offering a chance. A chance. Not a slow death." His plan was desperate and daring. He proposed building a raft from anything they could tear from the deck. They would take almost all the water, a makeshift sail, and try to reach the shipping lanes. He didn't say that this would mean certain death for those left on the boat. He spoke of a chance for the strong. He appealed to their selfishness, their instinct for self-preservation, which was stronger than any discipline. He found followers. A few of the most desperate sailors who had already lost all hope. They began to secretly gather planks and hoard their water rations. The conspiracy festered like a boil. Henke could not fail to notice the change. The tension among the crew became almost palpable. Men avoided his gaze. He felt he was losing control. The climax came on the 40th day of their drift. At night, one of the lookouts, loyal to the captain, reported that Richter's group was preparing to launch the raft. Henke did not raise the alarm. He took the only pistol on board, with its last 3 bullets, and walked silently to the deck. In the moonlight, he saw the conspirators. Richter, seeing him, was not afraid. He stood up straight and looked the captain in the eye. "This isn't mutiny, Werner. It's evolution. The strongest survive. Your system isn't working. We're giving ourselves a chance." Henke did not reply. He slowly scanned the pale faces of the sailors standing behind Richter. He saw in their eyes not malice, but only mortal exhaustion and fear. And then he made his decision. He did not shoot. He did something far more cruel. He offered the pistol to Richter. "All right, Klaus. You're right. I'm tired. You're the commander now. But before you leave, you must do what a commander must do. We have 15 men left who can't go with you. They're too weak. We have no water or food for them. So they don't suffer, you must kill them. Here, start with Franz. He's going to die soon anyway." He pointed to the young seaman Bauer, who was lying on the deck, shivering with fever. Richter turned pale. He looked at the pistol in his hand, then at the faces of his supporters. He saw the horror in their eyes turn to disgust. He was ready for a mutiny, but he was not ready to be an executioner. His pragmatism had collided with the final bastion of humanity. He slowly lowered the hand holding the pistol. The mutiny was crushed, not by force of arms, but by the force of a moral choice. Richter was broken and humiliated. Henke had re-established his authority, but he paid a terrible price. He had shown everyone the monstrous cruelty he was capable of to maintain order. The brotherhood was shattered. Now, only fear united them. And while they were dealing with each other, they failed to notice that their true enemy, the ocean, was preparing its final, devastating blow. The internal enemy was defeated, but the victory brought no relief. The atmosphere on board grew even more oppressive. The men obeyed Henke without question, but it was now the obedience of slaves. not comrades. They were surviving, but they were no longer a whole. And it was at this moment of total moral desolation that the ocean decided to show its true power. It began with the sky. It lost its bright blue color, turning a murky, leaden gray. The horizon vanished, dissolved in a gray haze. Boatswain Weber, looking at the dead swell that rolled across the water without any wind, rasped, "It's coming. A big one." By evening, the sky had turned black. The wind, which had previously only lazily stirred their makeshift top, became a ferocious beast. It howled through the tattered rigging, tearing white foam from the crests of the waves. The waves grew before their eyes, transforming from rolling hills into mountains of water. U-515, deprived of propulsion and steering, became a plaything of the elements. It was tossed from wave to wave like a wood chip. Being on deck became impossible. Henke gave the order, "Everyone inside, batten down the hatches." They locked themselves in their steel prison, surrendering to the mercy of the ocean. What began next defies description. It was a hell of claustrophobia and primal terror. The boat was thrown about so violently that men were sent flying across compartments, slamming into bulkheads and machinery. Every minute, tons of water crashed down on the hull. The impacts were so powerful it felt as though the strong steel would crack like an eggshell. The sound was deafening. The roar of the storm outside mingled with the screeching and groaning of the metal itself. It sounded as if giant monsters were gnawing at their boat, trying to tear it apart. Inside, darkness reigned, broken only by the dim glow of emergency lamps. The air quickly became stale. Men lay on the floor, clinging to anything they could to avoid being killed against a wall. They vomited. They moaned in pain and fear. In those hours, there was no commander, no subordinates, no heroes, no traitors. There were only 41 men, trapped in a steel box at the bottom of a roaring hell. The storm raged for 2 days, 2 days of endless terror. Time stood still. They lost track of the hours. The young seaman Franz Bauer, weakened by the previous hardships, began to rave. He called for his mother, his fiancée Anna. He cried and begged for the hatch to be opened to let in fresh air. He had to be held down by force to keep him from doing something foolish. At one point, at the peak of the storm, a colossal rogue wave crashed over the boat. U-515 listed so heavily that it was almost on its side. Men flew screaming to one side. Anything not bolted down rained down with a deafening crash. For a few seconds they were frozen in this unnatural position on the verge of capsizing. This was the end. They all knew it. But then, slowly with an agonizing groan, the boat began to right itself. It had held. It had survived a mortal blow. When the storm began to subside and Henke, staggering, climbed to the bridge, he did not recognize his boat. The deck was swept clean. Everything they had built for weeks, the water collection system, the fishing gear, all washed away by the waves. The boat was mutilated, but intact. They had survived. But the price of this victory was terrible. When they went below, they found that Franz Bauer was no longer breathing. His weak heart had not withstood the ordeal. He had died not of hunger or thirst, but of pure, concentrated terror. They wrapped his body in a piece of canvas and after a short prayer, committed him to the sea. His death was the point of no return for them. They had lost their symbol of innocence, their younger brother. And it was at that very moment, in the deafening silence that followed the storm, that the lookout on the bridge let out a cry. But it was not a cry of horror. It was a cry of astonishment. He was pointing toward the horizon where the sun was breaking through the clouds, and in the sky birds were circling. Not seabirds, different ones. Small, land-based birds. The birds were messengers, silent prophets whose appearance heralded the end of their endless journey. The old boatswain Weber, looking at them with tear-filled eyes, whispered, "Land. They're flying from land." This news, this hope, was like an electric shock. The men, who just an hour ago had been ready to die, crawled out onto the deck, gazing at the sky with childlike wonder. They shouted, waved at the birds, laughed and cried at the same time. For the next 2 days they drifted, their eyes fixed on the west. And then, on the 62nd day of their odyssey, they saw it. At first it was just a thin, barely visible strip on the horizon, like a cloud. But it didn't dissolve. It grew. It became clearer. It was land. The euphoria was overwhelming. They forgot about the hunger, the thirst, the death of Franz. They embraced. Even Henke allowed himself a faint, tired smile. They had done it. They had crossed the Atlantic in a dead submarine. They had won. They were cast onto a sandy shore somewhere on the coast of North Carolina. The boat ran aground with a dull grating sound listing to one side. The end. The journey was over. They opened the hatches and, staggering like drunkards, one by one began to descend onto solid ground. The feeling of sand under their feet after 2 months on a steel deck was indescribable. Some fell to their knees and kissed the earth. They looked like wraiths from another world, emaciated, bearded, in tattered, salt-stiffened clothes. There were 40 of them. The first person they met was an old local sheriff named Baker, who had driven up in his battered car after hearing from fishermen about a strange ship washed ashore. He got out of his car, holding an old revolver, and froze in amazement. Before him stood a group of ragged men who looked more like skeletons, and behind them loomed the rusted hulk of a German submarine. Henke, gathering his last strength, took a step forward. He spoke in broken English he had learned in school. "We are the crew of the German submarine U-515. We surrender." Sheriff Baker was silent for a long time, looking at them, then slowly lowered his revolver. There was no hatred in his eyes, only shock and a kind of human pity. He took a canteen of water from his car and handed it to Henke. The gesture was more eloquent than any words. Their salvation, which they had awaited for so long, turned out to be ironic and bitter. They were not greeted as heroes who had escaped the clutches of death. They were enemies surrendering into captivity. A few hours later, the military arrived. Men in perfect uniforms with well-fed, confident faces. They cordoned off the boat and loaded the Germans into trucks. No one asked them about their journey. No one showed a shred of surprise. For the American military, it was just another captured enemy submarine. Standard procedure. As they were being driven away, Henke turned and looked one last time at his U-515, lying helplessly on its side like a beached, dead whale. It had been his home, his prison, and his salvation. He realized that their odyssey, their incredible feat of survival, meant nothing here, in this civilized world. They were just a footnote in a report, a trophy. Their survival in hell was merely the first circle of their trials. A new hell lay ahead, the hell of oblivion. The fate of the surviving crew of U-515 became the embodiment of the tragic irony that history so loves. Their incredible feat, their 2-month struggle for life, proved to be of no interest to anyone. They were separated and sent to different prisoner of war camps. Captain Werner Henke, as the commander, was interrogated with particular rigor. He honestly and in detail told his story, presenting the logbook kept by Richter as proof. The American officers listened with polite disbelief. The story of drifting across the entire Atlantic in a dead submarine, of a homemade desalinator built from a torpedo, seemed to them the ravings of a madman or a clever piece of disinformation. His account was so incredible that it was easier not to believe it. He was considered either a liar or a man whose mind had been broken by his ordeal. He and his men were never again questioned about their journey. The official U.S. Navy report was dry and concise. German submarine U-515, having sustained damage, was beached on the coast of North Carolina. Crew of 40 men taken prisoner. And that was all. Not a word about 2 months of hell. Not a word about unbending will and brilliant ingenuity. Their story was buried in the archives under a classified stamp, an inconvenient and insignificant detail of the Great War. Werner Henke never returned to Germany. He died in a POW camp in Arizona in 1945, shortly before the end of the war. It was said that he died not of illness, but of despair. from the realization that his greatest achievement, saving 40 lives in inhuman conditions, had been erased from history. He departed this life a broken man, whose truth was deemed a fiction. Klaus Richter, his eternal opponent, survived the war. He returned to Hamburg, became a successful lawyer, and never spoke of what happened in the Atlantic. For him, it was a memory of his own humiliation, of the moment his pragmatism and ambition shattered against the rock of humanity. He chose to forget. Erich Funke, the brilliant mechanic who saved them all with his mad invention, returned to a factory after the war and worked his entire life as a modest engineer. He was a quiet, withdrawn man, and none of his colleagues ever suspected that this humble worker had once cheated the ocean itself. The old boatswain, Günther Weber, the keeper of sea wisdom, did not survive captivity. His body, exhausted by the drift, could not fight off illness. He died in the camp hospital, and his last words, it was said, were, "The sea let me go, but the land would not have me." The fates of the other sailors were lost in the chaos of the post-war years. They returned home, but forever remained men marked by the ocean. They were haunted by nightmares. They couldn't bear to be in enclosed spaces for long. They flinched at the sound of dripping water. They had survived physically, but their souls remained forever in that steel coffin in the middle of the Atlantic. Their brotherhood, forged in inhuman trials, was destroyed first by distrust, and then by oblivion. Their fate was buried alive. Official history, written by the victors, left not a single line for the feet of the U-515 crew. Their incredible odyssey was reduced to a dry paragraph in a classified report, gathering dust in an archive. The war machine, with its cynicism and bureaucracy, found nothing heroic in their story. To it, this was merely a fluke, an unfortunate incident. But true stories do not die. They go underground. They become legends. The story of U-515, erased from the official chronicles, survived. It survived in whispers. German submariners told it to each other in prisoner-of-war camps, passing on details that only those who were there could have known. It became a soldier's yarn, a myth of a ghost boat that refused to die. A belief circulated among Kriegsmarine veterans that Captain Henke's spirit never found peace, that he still wanders the Atlantic floor, guiding his dead boat on its eternal drift. The story also survived on the other side of the ocean. For many years, old fishermen from North Carolina told their children and grandchildren about the ghost ship that appeared one morning out of nowhere. They spoke of the skeleton men who came ashore from it, and of the eyes of their commander, which held all the torment of hell. The story became part of the local folklore, a scary bedtime story. Thus, the feat rejected by official history found immortality in folk memory. It became a symbol not of military valor but of something greater, a symbol of the unbending will to live, which sprouts even on the most scorched earth. This was not a story about victory in battle. It was a story about the victory of man over chaos, over his own despair, over the indifference of the universe. The crew of U-515 lost the war. They lost the battle for recognition. But they won their most important battle, the battle for the right to remain human in inhuman conditions. And their legend, passed from mouth to mouth, became a monument not only to them, but to all the nameless heroes whose stories were too incredible, too inconvenient, too human for the soulless pages of military history. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten event. It is a reminder that man's most terrible enemy is not another man in a uniform, nor the blind forces of nature. The most terrible enemy is oblivion. And the greatest feat is not to die for one's country, but to survive against all odds so that your story can be told.